focused he gets. At this point, his body language told me he couldn't wait to dive into these seemingly dangerous waters. Clearing his throat, Craig began. With all due respect, he said, Michael Martin is a philosopher, not a historian, and I don't think he understands the historian's craft. For a philosopher, if something is inconsistent, the law of contradiction says this cannot be true, throw it out. However, the historian looks at these narratives and says, I see some inconsistencies, but I notice something about them. They're all in the secondary details. The core of the story is the same. Joseph of Arimathea takes the body of Jesus, puts it in a tomb. The tomb is visited by a small group of women followers of Jesus early on the Sunday morning following the crucifixion, and they find that the tomb is empty. They see a vision of angels saying that Jesus is risen. The careful historian, unlike the philosopher, doesn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. He says, this suggests that there is a historical core to this story that is reliable and can be depended upon, however conflicting the secondary details might be. So we can have great confidence in the core that's common to the narratives and that would be agreed upon by the majority of New Testament scholars today, even if there are differences concerning the names of the women, the exact time of the morning, the number of the angels, and so forth. Those kind of secondary discrepancies wouldn't bother a historian. Even the usually skeptical historian Michael Grant, a fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, and professor at Edinburgh University, concedes in his book, Jesus, an Historian's Review of the Gospels, true, the discovery of the empty tomb is differently described by the various Gospels, but if we apply the same sort of criteria that we would apply to any other ancient literary sources, then the evidence is firm and plausible enough to necessitate the conclusion that the tomb was indeed found empty. Sometimes, while covering criminal trials, I've seen two witnesses give the exact same testimony down to the nitty-gritty details, only to find themselves ripped apart by the defense attorney for having colluded before the trial. So I remarked to Craig, I suppose if all four Gospels were identical in their minutiae, that would have raised a suspicion of plagiarism. Yes, that's a very good point, he said. The differences between the empty tomb narratives suggest that we have multiple, independent attestation of the empty tomb story. Sometimes people say Matthew and Luke just plagiarized from Mark. But when you look at the narratives closely, you see divergences that suggest that even if Matthew and Luke did know Mark's account, nevertheless, they also had separate, independent sources for the empty tomb story. So, with these multiple and independent accounts, no historian would disregard this evidence just because of secondary discrepancies. Let me give you a secular example. We have two narratives of Hannibal crossing the Alps to attack Rome, and they're incompatible and irreconcilable. Yet no classical historian doubts the fact that Hannibal did mount such a campaign. That's a non-biblical illustration of discrepancies in secondary details failing to undermine the historical core of a historical story. I conceded the power of that argument, and as I reflected on Martin's critique, it seemed to me that some of his alleged contradictions could be rather easily reconciled. I mentioned this to Craig by saying, aren't there ways to harmonize some of the differences among these accounts? Yes, that's right, there are, Craig replied. For example, the time of the visit to the tomb. One writer might describe it as still being dark, while the other might be saying it was getting light. But that's sort of like the optimist and the pessimist arguing over whether the glass was half empty or half full. It was around dawn, and they were describing the same thing with different words. As for the number and names of the women, none of the Gospels pretend to give a complete list. They all include Mary Magdalene and other women. So there was probably a gaggle of these early disciples that included those who were named and probably a couple of others. I think it would be pedantic to say that's a contradiction. What about the different accounts of what happened afterwards? I asked. Mark said the women didn't tell anybody, and the other Gospels say they did. Craig explained, when you look at Mark's theology, He loves to emphasize awe and fright and terror and worship in the presence of the divine. So this reaction of the women, of fleeing with fear and trembling and saying nothing to anyone because they were afraid, is all part of Mark's literary and theological style. It could well be that this was a temporary silence, and then the women went back and told the others what had happened. In fact, he concluded with a grin, it had to be a temporary silence. Otherwise, Mark couldn't be telling the story about it. I wanted to ask about one other commonly cited discrepancy. Jesus said in Matthew 12, verse 40, "For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." However, the Gospels report that Jesus was really in the tomb 1 full day, 2 full nights, and part of 2 days. Isn't this an example of Jesus being wrong in not fulfilling his own prophecy? Some well-meaning Christians have used this verse to suggest Jesus was crucified on Wednesday rather than on Friday in order to get the full time in there, Craig said. But most scholars recognize that according to early Jewish time reckoning, any part of a day counted as a full day. Jesus was in the tomb Friday afternoon, all day Saturday, and on Sunday morning. Under the way that Jews conceptualized time back then, this would have counted as 3 days. Again, he concluded, that's just another example of how many of these discrepancies can be explained or minimized with some background knowledge, or by just thinking them through with an open mind. The Gospels agreed that the empty tomb was discovered by women who were friends and followers of Jesus. But that, in Martin's estimation, makes their testimony suspect, since they were probably not objective observers. So I put the question to Craig. Does the women's relationship with Jesus call the reliability of their testimony into question? Unwittingly, I had played right into Craig's hand. Actually, this argument backfires on people who use it, Craig said in response. Certainly, these women were friends of Jesus. But when you understand the role of women in first-century Jewish society, what's really extraordinary is that this empty tomb story should feature women as the discoverers of the empty tomb in the first place. Women were on a very low rung of the social ladder in first-century Palestine. There are old rabbinical sayings that said, "Let the words of the law be burned rather than delivered to women," and "Blessed is he whose children are male, but woe to him whose children are female." Women's testimony was regarded as so worthless that they weren't generally allowed to serve as legal witnesses in a Jewish court of law. In light of this, it's absolutely remarkable that the chief witnesses to the empty tomb are these women who were friends of Jesus. Any later legendary account would have certainly portrayed male disciples as discovering the tomb, Peter or John, for example. The fact that women are the first witnesses to the empty tomb is most plausibly explained by the reality that, like it or not, they were the discoverers of the empty tomb. This shows that the gospel writers faithfully recorded what happened, even if it was embarrassing. This bespeaks the historicity of this tradition, rather than its legendary status. Craig's explanation, however, left yet another question lingering. Why were the women going to anoint the body of Jesus if they already knew that his tomb was securely sealed? Do their actions really make sense? I asked. Craig thought for a moment before he answered, this time not in his debater's voice, but in a more tender tone. Lee, I strongly feel that scholars who have not known the love and devotion that these women felt for Jesus have no right to pronounce cool judgments upon the feasibility of what they wanted to do. For people who are grieving, who have lost someone they desperately loved and followed, to want to go to the tomb in a forlorn hope of anointing the body, I just don't think some later critic can treat them like robots and say they shouldn't have gone. He shrugged his shoulders. Maybe they thought there would be men around who could move the stone. If there were guards, maybe they thought they would. I don't know. Certainly the notion of visiting a tomb to pour oils over a body is a historical Jewish practice. The only question is the feasibility of who would move the stone for them. And I don't think we're in the right position to pronounce judgment on whether or not they should have simply stayed home. In preparing for my interview with Craig, I had heard more than one skeptic claim that a major argument against the empty tomb is that none of the apostles, including Peter, bothered to point it out in their preaching. But when I asked Craig about this issue, his eyes widened. "I just don't think that's true," he replied, a bit of astonishment in his voice, as he picked up his Bible and turned to the 2nd chapter of Acts, which records Peter's sermon at Pentecost. "The empty tomb is found in Peter's speech," Craig insisted. "He proclaims in verse 24 that God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death. Then he quotes from a psalm about how God would not allow his Holy One to undergo decay. This had been written by David, and Peter says, 'I can tell you confidently that the patriarch David died and was buried, and his tomb is here to this day.' But, he says, Christ was not abandoned to the realm of the dead, nor did his body see decay. God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of it." Craig looked up from the Bible. This speech contrasts David's tomb, which remained to that day, with the prophecy in which David says Christ would be raised up. His flesh wouldn't suffer decay. It's clearly implicit that the tomb was left empty. Then he turned to a later chapter in the book of Acts. In Acts 13, verses 29 through 31, Paul says, "When they had carried out all that was written about him, they took him down from the cross and laid him in a tomb. But God raised him from the dead, and for many days he was seen by those who had traveled with him from Galilee to Jerusalem." Certainly the empty tomb is implicit there. He shut his Bible, then added, "I think it's rather wooden and unreasonable to contend that these early preachers didn't refer to the empty tomb just because they didn't use the two specific words, empty tomb. There's no question that they knew, and that their audiences understood from their preaching, that Jesus' tomb was vacant." I had spent the first part of our interview peppering Craig with objections and arguments challenging the empty tomb. But I suddenly realized that I hadn't given him the opportunity to spell out his affirmative case. While he had already alluded to several reasons why he believes Jesus' tomb was unoccupied, I said, "Why don't you give me your best shot? Convince me with your top 4 or 5 reasons that the empty tomb is a historical fact." Craig rose to the challenge. One by one, he spelled out his arguments concisely and powerfully. First, he said, the empty tomb is definitely implicit in the early tradition that is passed along by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, which is a very old and reliable source of historical information about Jesus. Second, the site of Jesus' tomb was known to Christian and Jew alike. So if it weren't empty, it would be impossible for a movement founded on the belief in the resurrection to have come into existence in the same city where this man had been publicly executed and buried. Third, we can tell from the language, grammar, and style that Mark got his empty tomb story, actually his whole passion narrative, from an earlier source. In fact, there's evidence it was written before AD 37, which is much too early for legend to have seriously corrupted it. A.N. Sherwin-White, the respected Greco-Roman classical historian from Oxford University, said it would have been without precedent anywhere in history for legend to have grown up that fast and significantly distorted the Gospels. Fourth, there's the simplicity of the empty tomb story in Mark. Fictional apocryphal accounts from the 2nd century contain all kinds of flowery narratives, in which Jesus comes out of the tomb in glory and power, with everyone seeing him, including the priests, Jewish authorities, and Roman guards. Those are the way legends read, but these don't come until generations after the events, which is after eyewitnesses have died off. By contrast, Mark's account of the story of the empty tomb is stark in its simplicity and unadorned by theological reflection. Fifth, the unanimous testimony that the empty tomb was discovered by women argues for the authenticity of the story, because this would have been embarrassing for the disciples to admit, and most certainly would have been covered up if this were a legend. Sixth, the earliest Jewish polemic presupposes the historicity of the empty tomb. In other words, there was nobody who was claiming that the tomb still contained Jesus' body. The question always was, what happened to the body? The Jews proposed the ridiculous story that the guards had fallen asleep. Obviously, they were grasping at straws. But the point is this. They started with the assumption that the tomb was vacant. Why? Because they knew that it was. I listened intently as Craig articulated each point, and to me the 6 arguments added up to an impressive case. However, I still wanted to see if there were any loopholes before concluding it was airtight. Kersop Lake suggested in 1907 that the women merely went to the wrong tomb, I said. He says they got lost, and a caretaker at an unoccupied tomb told them, "You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. He is not here." And they ran away afraid. Isn't that a plausible explanation? Craig sighed. Lake didn't generate any following with this, he said. The reason is that the site of Jesus' tomb was known to the Jewish authorities. Even if the women had made this mistake, the authorities would have been only too happy to point out the tomb and correct the disciples' error when they began to proclaim that Jesus had risen from the dead. I don't know anybody who holds to Lake's theory today. Frankly, other options didn't sound very likely either. Obviously, the disciples had no motive to steal the body and then endure deprivation and suffering as a result. And certainly the Jewish authorities wouldn't have removed the body. I said, we're left with the theory that the empty tomb was a later legend, and that by the time it developed, people were unable to disprove it because the location of the tomb had been forgotten. That has been the issue ever since 1835, when David Strauss claimed these stories are legendary, Craig replied. And that's why in our conversation today, we focus so much on this legendary hypothesis by showing that the empty tomb story goes back to within a few years of the events themselves. This renders the legend theory worthless. Even if there were some legendary elements in the secondary details of the story, the historical core of the story remains securely established. Yes, there were answers for these alternative explanations. Upon analysis, every theory seemed to crumble under the weight of evidence and logic. But the only remaining option was to believe that the crucified Jesus returned to life, a conclusion some people find too extraordinary to swallow. I thought for a moment about how I would phrase this in a question to Craig. Finally, I said,
even though these alternative theories admittedly have holes in them, aren't they more plausible than the absolutely incredible idea that Jesus was God incarnate who was raised from the dead?
This, I think, is the issue, he said, leaning forward. I think people who push these alternative theories would admit, yes, our theories are implausible, but they're not as improbable as the idea that this spectacular miracle occurred. However, at this point, the matter is no longer a historical issue. Instead, it's a philosophical question about whether miracles are possible. And what, I asked, would you say to that? I would argue that the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead is not at all improbable. In fact, based on the evidence, it's the best explanation for what happened. What is improbable is the hypothesis that Jesus rose naturally from the dead. That, I would agree, is outlandish. Any hypothesis would be more probable than saying the corpse of Jesus spontaneously came back to life. But the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead doesn't contradict science or any known facts of experience. All it requires is the hypothesis that God exists. And I think there are good, independent reasons for believing that he does. With that, Craig added this clincher. As long as the existence of God is even possible, it's possible that he acted in history by raising Jesus from the dead. Craig was convincing. The empty tomb, admittedly a miracle of staggering proportions, did make sense in light of the evidence. And it was only part of the case for the resurrection. From Craig's Atlanta home, I was getting ready to go to Virginia to interview a renowned expert on the evidence for the appearances of the resurrected Jesus, and then to California to speak with another scholar about the considerable circumstantial evidence. As I thanked Craig and his wife Jan for their hospitality, I reflected to myself that up close, in his blue jeans and white socks, Craig didn't look like the kind of formidable adversary who would devastate the best resurrection critics in the world. But I had heard the tapes of the debates for myself. In the face of the facts, they have been impotent to put Jesus' body back into the tomb. They flounder, they struggle, they snatch at straws, they contradict themselves, they pursue desperate and extraordinary theories to try to account for the evidence. Yet each time, in the end, the tomb remains vacant. I was reminded of the assessment by one of the towering legal intellects of all time, the Cambridge-educated Sir Norman Anderson, who lectured at Princeton University, was offered a professorship for life at Harvard University, and served as dean of the Faculty of Laws at the University of London. His conclusion, after a lifetime of analyzing this issue from a legal perspective, was summed up in one sentence. The empty tomb, then, forms a veritable rock on which all rationalistic theories of the resurrection dash themselves in vain.